The Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution begins, "No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury." A capital crime, as mentioned here, means a crime for which the penalty can be death. Even in the Bill of Rights, it was clear that our early leaders believed that the death penalty was a legitimate form of punishment, at least for certain crimes. But many people believe, and have long believed, differently, and there has long been a movement to abolish the death penalty in this country. As progressives are generally, though not universally, opposed to the death penalty, we're going to look at this issue with a view toward abolishing capital punishment. We'll look at the history of capital punishment in America, the legal issues surrounding it with special attention to Supreme Court cases, and how to combat it in this episode of Progressive Solutions. As always, I welcome your comments. Where do you stand on the death penalty, and why? Are there other issues you want to see on this series? Let me know in the comments below. The death penalty has been controversial through much of history, and attempts to abolish it go back centuries. In Japan, they actually did abolish it from the early 9th century to the mid-12th century, although today about 80% of Japanese people support it. In the US, attempts to abolish the death penalty go back to the beginning of the country. Thomas Jefferson tried and failed to limit the death penalty in his home state of Virginia to cases of murder and treason. By 1794, Benjamin Rush, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, along with Benjamin Franklin, who also signed it, and William Bradford, who would later become the nation's second Attorney General, had pushed successfully to limit the death penalty in Pennsylvania to cases of first-degree murder only. Rush argued that capital punishment, far from being a deterrent, actually led to more crimes being committed in what was called the brutalization effect. And the question of deterrence has been debated ever since. There are recent studies that claim that it is a deterrent, and recent studies that claim that it isn't. Interestingly, the studies that claim that it is were done by economists, while those that claim that it isn't were done by sociologists and criminologists. One meta-analysis conducted in 2005 tried to reconcile the two sides by showing that states that only executed a few people had a brutalization effect, while states that executed a lot of people had a deterrent effect. But this study has two major flaws. First, it adjusts for race in a way that assumes that black people are more likely to commit murder and therefore more likely to be deterred by executions. And second, because it treats every state the same regardless of that state's population. Basically, we don't know if executing people has a deterrent effect. We just don't know. So we move on to the next question. Does capital punishment violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment? The Supreme Court has never directly addressed this issue, using the Eighth Amendment only as part of the bigger picture. Meanwhile, the court has spent a long time narrowing what was acceptable under the Eighth Amendment. It all began in 1878, as the court ruled in Wilkinson v. Utah that methods of extreme pain and torture, even as punishment for capital crimes, was unconstitutional. Much more recently, the court has ruled that people who are insane or intellectually disabled can't be executed. They also ruled that people who commit their crimes while a minor are also ineligible for execution. But the Supreme Court has never directly ruled that capital punishment violates the Eighth Amendment. In fact, and this is going to shock a lot of people, the Supreme Court never ruled that the death penalty is unconstitutional. Now, hold on. Before you come at me with torches and pitchforks claiming that the Supreme Court really did rule it unconstitutional in 1972, let's take a look at what they actually did. The case in question is Furman v. Georgia, which was actually a combination of three separate cases. In one, William Furman had killed someone during the commission of a burglary, and in the other two, one from Georgia and one from Texas, the men had been convicted of rape. Now, the Supreme Court ruled that rape was an insufficient crime to merit the death penalty, which left only the Furman case. About the only thing that the Supreme Court's 9 justices could agree on was the key question. Does the imposition and carrying out of the death penalty in these cases constitute cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments? Why the 14th Amendment too? Because the challengers claimed that the way the death penalty was imposed violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause by discriminating against black people. Even the 5 justices who ruled that the way the death penalty was dealt with did violate the Constitution disagreed as to why. In a remarkable departure from common practice, each one of the 5 justices wrote his own opinion. Only 2 justices, Brennan and Marshall, wrote that the death penalty itself is a violation of the 8th and 14th Amendments. The other 3 in the majority focused their decision solely on the question of unequal treatment. Justice Douglas wrote, "It would seem to be incontestable that the death penalty inflicted on one defendant is unusual if it discriminates against him by reason of his race, religion, wealth, social position, or class, or if it is imposed under a procedure that gives room for the play of such prejudices." He went on, "There is evidence that the provision of the English Bill of Rights of 1689, from which the language of the 8th Amendment was taken, was concerned primarily with selective or irregular application of harsh penalties, and that its aim was to forbid arbitrary and discriminatory penalties of a severe nature." In other words, his problem with the death penalty only extended to whether it was applied in an arbitrary or discriminatory way. Justice Stewart was more specific. "At least 2 of my brothers have concluded that the infliction of the death penalty is constitutionally impermissible in all circumstances under the 8th and 14th Amendments. Their case is a strong one, but I find it unnecessary to reach the ultimate question they would decide." And Justice White wrote, "In joining the court's judgments, I do not at all intimate that the death penalty is unconstitutional per se, or that there is no system of capital punishment that would comport with the 8th Amendment. In other words, a majority of the justices, 7 out of 9, said that the death penalty was not unconstitutional. The Supreme Court merely ruled that the way the death penalty was applied violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, and that's why it was cruel and unusual under the 8th Amendment. The immediate effect was that all death penalty sentences were commuted to life because no state could prove that the way they had the death penalty didn't discriminate. The next almost immediate step was that a lot of states hustled to craft a system that the Supreme Court would accept as having sufficient safeguards against discrimination. It took 4 years for the next case to come before the Supreme Court. In this situation, there were 5 separate cases, one each from Georgia, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, and Louisiana, all heard at once and generally referred to by the lead case, Gregg v. Georgia. Now, by 1976, 35 states and the federal government had created new systems designed to ensure that discrimination didn't play a part in sentencing someone to death. The 5 states in this case all wanted the Supreme Court to rule that their systems met the standards set out in Furman. Most quick references on this case state that on the other side, the lawyers were trying to get the court to rule that the death penalty by itself was unconstitutional. And they did try that, but this would have been a bad primary strategy, as in the intervening 4 years, only one justice, Douglas, had been replaced by John Paul Stevens, which meant that they would have had to convince at least 2 and possibly 3 justices to change their mind. So the main thrust of their case was that even the new laws didn't meet the Furman standard. And in 2 of the states, Louisiana and North Carolina, the court agreed that they didn't meet the standard. But Georgia, Florida, and Texas had succeeded, and the death penalty was back. Since then, most national attacks on the death penalty have been limited to trying to carve out different groups of people who weren't subject to execution. Eliminating the death penalty has been a state-by-state operation. 20 states plus the District of Columbia currently outlaw the death penalty. 6 of those states outlawed it in the last decade, either by legislation or by a state Supreme Court outlawing it. Interestingly, while over 1,500 people have been executed since 1976, the annual number of executions peaked in 1999 and has been dropping ever since. This year, as I record this video, we're on pace to have the lowest number of executions since 1992. And since the murder rate has also fallen during most of those 20 years, perhaps the claim that the death penalty is a deterrent isn't such a good claim after all. Just saying. Public opinion polls, while moving toward opposition, still show a majority in favor of the death penalty. On the other hand, over the last 25 years, support for the death penalty has dropped from 80% down to 56%. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court has rejected at least one attempt in 1987 to claim that even new death penalty laws were still discriminatory and didn't meet the Furman standards. This ruling is especially disturbing because, in this case, the Supreme Court refused to acknowledge a study that showed that the laws were discriminatory. Instead, they ruled that an individual defendant had to prove that he or she was being discriminated against. This sets a dangerous precedent. Until we have a Supreme Court that's likely to be willing to overturn its 1987 decision, at least to allowing evidence that a state's death penalty system still discriminates, there's little likelihood of getting action at the national level. The fight will still have to happen state by state. Now, it's possible to get the highest court in a state to rule that that state's death penalty is unconstitutional, and this has happened in Delaware, Washington, and New York. But in general, the appeal is going to have to be made to the legislature and the governor, which means it's going to have to be made to the public, because politicians are not going to take a stand on this unless they feel that they're politically safe to do so. The appeal to the public is even more essential in states like California and Oregon, where the death penalty is part of the Constitution, and it'll take a referendum to overturn it. Recent trends give hope as support for the death penalty is shrinking, but those trends can change quickly. Meanwhile, in several states that have abolished the death penalty, there are major attempts to revive it. So how can we persuade people to oppose the death penalty? We can pretty much forget about trying the deterrence versus brutalization effect, as there's no proof either way. There are studies on both sides, and most people are just going to believe the studies they want to believe. There's another argument, though. Since the Furman decision, while about 1,500 people have been executed, at least 170 people who were sentenced to death were later exonerated. This means that 1 out of 10 people who's sentenced to death is actually innocent. Also, even in Texas, which has over 1/3 of all the executions in the nation, 99.2% of murder cases don't result in an execution. In Virginia, the number 2 state for executions, that's 99.4%. So the death penalty, even in the most pro-execution states, doesn't seem to be used often enough to make a difference. And then there's the cost. Because of anti-discrimination systems in place, the cost of getting somebody actually executed is enormous, far more than it costs just to lock them up for the rest of their lives. If the death penalty is almost never the end result, and if it costs so much to execute people, wouldn't that money be better spent fighting crime in general, or hiring more teachers, or even cutting taxes? People may want the death penalty, but they'd probably rather have their tax money spent on something else and locking the worst criminals up for life. In fact, a recent Gallup poll showed that most Americans would rather lock people up for life than execute them. Finally, there's the question of how to execute someone. Recent problems with lethal injection, particularly the likelihood that the 3-drug cocktail actually inflicts torture on its victims, has reignited the entire debate about procedures. It'll take years, probably decades, to eliminate capital punishment in the United States, but it can be done, and it is being done slowly but surely. The key to ultimate success is not giving up. Meanwhile, there are plenty of other reforms that our criminal justice system could use, and I'll be covering those in a later video. Again, if you want to see more of these videos, please hit that subscribe button below and help spread the word. Meanwhile, leave your comments. What do you think about the death penalty? What do you think would be one of the more effective ways to combat it? And what other issues do you want to hear about? Thanks for watching. Stay progressive.